The Little Snoring Murders. Written and read by Malcolm Cowper. The village of Little Snoring lies deep in rural Essex. It had once been at the heart of the local farming community, but since the opening of the M11, it had been colonised by London commuters. House prices had risen to well beyond the reach of local people, who had been forced to move to more affordable areas. Every morning a procession of BMWs, Mercedes and Jaguars headed out of the village towards London, and an hour later a procession of Range Rovers, Qashqais and X-Trails made the brief journey to the village school. Although most children lived within walking distance, their mothers considered it essential to transport them by car, lest they become victims of the sex predators that were certain to be lurking behind every hedge and bus shelter. Despite these fears, Little Snoring rarely featured in the county crime statistics. The only lawbreakers were careless drivers who triggered the village speed camera, thus becoming involuntary donors to the Road Safety Fund, which is where proceeds from fines allegedly went. So it was a feeling of utter horror and disbelief that swept through the village when the news broke that a murder had been committed. The victim was just 5 years old, a Persian cat called Solomon, the prized possession of Mrs. Mildred Ponsonby Forbes. The wife of a stockbroker, she was referred to throughout the village, though never to her face, as the Queen Bee. She ran, or was involved with, virtually everything that went on: the church hall committee, the ladies' circle, the inner wheel, the WI, the school governing body, to name but a few. She saw little of her husband, his work, and his girlfriend, keeping him occupied in London till late in the evenings, while golf took up most of his weekends. Her children had left home and were now pursuing lucrative careers in offshore financial centres, and Solomon was all that filled the huge emotional void in her life. Mrs. Ponsonby Forbes was a large lady with a voice to match, and when she received the news that her beloved Solomon had been killed, the shriek of horror could be heard from one end of the village to the other. Horror turned to fury on a level that would have had Adolf Hitler shaking in his jackboots. Emails were fired out to every organisation in the village, with instructions that posters offering a £500 reward were to be placed in every window and on all notice boards. She contacted the police and demanded to speak to an officer of at least Chief Inspector rank. Unfortunately, the county CID were fully involved with a human murder, and a lowly PCSO was the only officer available to interview her. This did nothing to placate her, especially when the best he could offer was a business card with a crime reference number and an assurance that no stone would be left unturned in the hunt for the killer. The murder of Solomon was the talk of the village for the next few days. He appeared to have been killed by an airgun pellet, but as no suspect was identified, interest died away despite Mrs. Ponsonby Forbes' best efforts to keep it alive. Eventually, life in Little Snoring returned to its usual tranquillity until some 3 months later, when another cat was found dead. Airgun wounds clearly indicated the same perpetrator. This time the owner was Piers Duckworth, an estate agent who had made a fortune out of the property boom and now occupied the largest house in the village, formerly the residence of the squire. Mrs. Ponsonby Forbes was delighted. She now had an ally whose misfortune enabled her to revive her flagging campaign and place her once again at the centre of the murder hunt. More posters and reward notices appeared around the village. The police, having now arrested and charged their murder suspect, sent a proper constable rather than a PCSO to make house-to-house inquiries. And as a precaution, all owners were advised not to let their cats out at night. The local press took up the story, and a reporter even came from the Daily Mail. Her piece did not fail to make mention of some East European migrant fruit pickers at one of the nearby farms as possible suspects. All these efforts were once again unsuccessful, and as before, interest eventually died down. 3 more months went by, and then one morning another cat was found shot dead. The owners this time were Reg and Mavis Turner, a couple whom the rest of the village described as chavs on account of the copious fake jewellery and tattoos with which they adorned their bodies. Nobody could explain how they could afford to live in Little Snoring. It was rumoured that they had bought their council house in Peckham at a giveaway price back in the 80s and had sold it at a vast profit. Others were convinced they were drug dealers. They claimed to be in the rag trade, but whether they had a factory, a shop, or just a market stall, nobody knew. Mrs. Ponsonby Forbes was reluctant to offer them her support, but on the premise that my enemy's enemy is my friend, she felt she had no choice. They, in their turn, spurned her approaches and declared that they would sort this business out once and for all. The genteel villagers were somewhat alarmed the next day by the arrival in 2 ex-army Land Rovers of a motley crew wearing combat boots, camouflage trousers, sleeveless vests, Ray-Ban shades and bandanas. These, it seemed, were friends of the Turners, who were going to nail the bastard. Equipped with night vision glasses and armed with baseball bats, they would patrol the streets every night till they caught him. This strategy might have been more effective had they not spent most of their evenings in the Dog and Partridge waiting till dark, by which time most of them were barely capable of standing up, let alone patrolling the streets. After a week, the Turners lost patience and sent them packing. It was good old-fashioned police work that finally brought the culprit to book. A keen young detective constable named Kevin Hardy decided one day to check the firearms register and discovered that an air pistol had a few months earlier been licensed to a Miss Edith Everdeen. D.C. Hardy knew an elderly woman of that name, one of the last remaining residents of the old village. Curious as to why she would want an air pistol, he decided to pay her a visit. It did not take him long to get the truth out of her. "I never got on with all them posh snobs that come into the village," she said. "We was a real community in the old days. Everybody looked out for each other. Now nobody talks to you." "Doesn't seem a good reason to go round shooting their cats," said Hardy. "Yes, well, I'm coming to that. I found my cat Daisy shot dead in my garden one morning. I knew who'd done it. It was the grandson of that Ponsonby Forbes woman, while he was staying with her on holiday. Nasty piece of work he was. Stirred up all the local kids to shout names at me, and I said I'd report them if they didn't clear off. The next day I found Daisy dead and a note pushed through the door. It said, 'We've killed your cat, you daft old bat.' Well, I went to see Mrs. P.F., and she said it couldn't possibly have been little Wayne. He was a good boy. So I thought, right, let's see how you like having your cat killed. I went out and bought the air pistol, practiced a bit, then in the night I went looking for a cat. I knew roughly where it would be, behind the bins, where all the cats gather looking for waste food, and I shot it. I didn't mean to shoot any others, but I enjoyed all the hue and cry, and watching them snobs running round like headless chickens, so I let things die down. Then I shot that estate agent's cat. He'd been pressuring me for months to sell my cottage, but I wouldn't. He got real nasty after a while, so I thought, I'll teach you to hassle me." "Why did you shoot the Turner's cat?" "Well, it was getting a bit like a drug by now. I couldn't stop. And I didn't like them Turners one little bit. The posh snobs are bad enough, but at least they got a bit of class. Them two belonged back in the slums. They didn't look after that cat properly anyway. Poor scrawny little thing." The district judge gave Miss Everdeen a 2-year suspended sentence and ordered her to surrender her firearm and licence. Most of the villagers thought it was outrageous that she had not gone to prison, but she didn't care. As she said to the reporters waiting outside the court, "Stuff that lot. I got 10,000 followers on Twitter. I'm a social media sensation."